So welcome. Today's webinar is live from the UNFCCC Bonn Climate Change Conference, and we're excited to have our colleague Nora Alamir with us. So first off, though, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Institute, we're the Global CCS Institute. We're an international carbon capture and storage think tank whose mission is to accelerate the scale up of CCS, which is a vital technology needed to tackle climate change. Our more than 150 international members include governments, companies, research bodies, and NGOs, all with a commitment to CCS as part of achieving a net zero future. My name is Jessica Oglesby. I'm our head of engagement and events, and I'm joined here today by Nora, as I mentioned. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. This discussion will be 30 minutes. If we have time, we will try and take audience questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website within a few days. So during the presentation or the discussion, if you have questions, we have a graphic here that shows you can go to the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A and submit your written questions. Then if we have time to get to those, we'll try and pull out at least one or two or, encompass some of the themes in a question here for Nora, but please go ahead and feel free to start submitting those while we get through some of the initial conversation. And then, like I said, if you miss any part of today's webinar, the recording will be available on our website in the coming days. So as climate negotiations continue in Bonn, we are bringing you the latest through today's webinar on international climate policy and CCS. And our session today will provide an overview of the key developments at the UNFCCC Climate Change Conference, as well as live insights from the Institute's Senior Global Advocacy Lead, Nora Alamir. I'm going to go ahead and go over some of the background a bit about Bonn. So the Bonn Climate Change Conference is an important milestone on the road to COP, that brings together the UNFCCC's subsidiary bodies to advance technical discussions and implementation efforts across a wide range of climate issues. As the UNFCCC's subsidiary body for Scientific and Technology Advice, or SBSTA, and subsidiary body for implementation, SBI, meet in Bonn, negotiators and stakeholders are working to build momentum on key issues that will help shape outcomes later this year at COP. As an accredited UNFCCC observer, the Institute is following these discussions closely, engaging with policymakers and stakeholders, and contributing to knowledge sharing on the role of CCS in achieving climate goals. So joining us today to share the insights from the conference, highlight key developments, and discuss the implications for CCS is Nora Alamir, the Senior Global Advocacy Lead, who's joining us from Bonn. So now, without further ado, Nora, how are you seeing the role of carbon management technologies evolve as the UNFCCC is increasingly shifting its focus from negotiation to implementation?
Hi, Jess. It's lovely to be back on these calls. I really do enjoy it actually when I'm out here. I think what strikes me the most is that the Bonn conversation is really shifting from whether carbon management belongs in climate strategies to how implementation actually happens. So Simon Steele opened SB64 last week with a strong focus on delivery, and the theme really runs through almost every discussion this week. So the incoming COP31 presidency, which is shared between Turkey and Australia, is also framing this period as one of acceleration and implementation rather than creating something entirely new. So one of the clearest examples of this is the growing importance of the Global Climate Action Agenda, which is the kind of voluntary parallel stream that happens at the COP. And the energy industry and transport axis, this has spent a lot of the last couple of weeks focusing on electrification. So this includes the COP31's presidency to achieve 35% electrification by 2035. So what's interesting is that the way the process is designed is that there's no specific technology that becomes a major negotiating item. But carbon management is increasingly intersecting with all the implementation discussions. So whether we're talking about industrial decarbonization, infrastructure, investment, finance, or technology deployment, the question is increasingly how countries deliver emission reductions in the real economy. So another initiative also worth watching this last couple of weeks is the Emerging Global Implementation Accelerator, which is exploring how to accelerate deployment solutions with system-wide cascading effects. So together, these discussions are suggesting that the focus is moving beyond just ambition setting, but towards implementation at scale. And another interesting theme this week is the negotiation process itself. So negotiators are actively discussing how to make the process more efficient, including agenda management, participation, arrangements, and multi-year planning. So there's also a dedicated discussion on rebuilding trust in the process. So it may sound procedural, but it really reflects a broader recognition that if the UNFCCC is going to continue to deliver, it also needs institutions that operate effectively and maintain confidence among participants.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I know you also recently authored a publication on policy entry points for carbon management as it relates to the UNFCCC. Can you touch on how the global stocktake influenced how CCS and CDR are being discussed in international and national climate planning?
Yeah, so the GST, the global stocktake, which was decided in Dubai at COP28 as part of the UAE consensus, it fundamentally shifted the conversation towards delivery pathways. So CCUS, particularly in hard to abate sectors, that's what the text says, was included in that document in paragraph 28. So one useful update that came out of this Bonn conference and continues to come out is the preparations for GST2, which is the second global stocktake. So the subsidiary body chairs had held an informal session on the design of the process, including timing, guiding questions, technical dialogues, and the role of scientific inputs, including the IPCC's seventh assessment report. And several parties are also calling for an early call for inputs. So while the GST formally starts at COP31, countries are already thinking about how to generate more useful implementation signals, learning from the first global stocktake. And there is growing recognition that GST2 needs to be useful not only for governments, but also for investors, business, and other stakeholders, trying to understand where the transition is heading. And we've also heard increasing number of discussions on how business perspectives can be reflected in the second global stocktake and what information can help drive investment decisions. So Switzerland, for example, mentioned that roadmaps might be needed from the private sectors in their statement yesterday. The timeline is also worth watching here. So the information gathering phase starts at COP31. The technical assessment starts in 2027, and then the political consideration, the conclusion is in 2028. So that's 5 years on from Dubai, as per the 5-year cycles of the Paris Agreement. And just another offshoot of this is several parties are also discussing how the GST outcomes should connect to the NDCs and the mitigation work program. So the broader significance here for carbon management is that countries are increasingly being asked not only what the targets are, but how they intend to achieve deep decarbonization, which naturally creates a space for discussions around industrial decarbonization, residual emissions, carbon removals.
Yeah, so great. Touching on that last point about what at the country level, what role should international cooperation play versus national policy in enabling CCS and CDR deployment?
So here both are essential. National governments ultimately create the conditions for deployment through permitting, regulation, infrastructure planning, investment frameworks. But one of the clearest messages from Bonn is that implementation increasingly depends on international cooperation in some ways. So Article 6 is a good example. So during the Article 6.2 ambition dialogue, countries discussed authorization systems, registries, MRV systems, tracking arrangements, and reporting obligations. Many developing countries raised concerns about what are called unilateral trade measures, like CBAM, so while the EU and others argue that trade can be a tool for accelerating climate action and clean technology deployment. So, another thing I think when it comes to international policy, and one of the success stories that came out of that's coming out of this conference is that negotiators are actually making headway on strengthening the links between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism. So that might sound technical, but it addresses a real challenge, which is how to move from technical assistance to projects that are actually financeable. So the key here is that developing countries need to say which technologies they want through their NDCs or their NAPs. So for carbon management, that connection between technology cooperation, capacity building, and finance is likely to become increasingly important in the international space.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier on in the webinar, this is something that, we've been doing year on year. You've been on the ground at Bonn. I see you've got delegates behind you, live on the scene as we speak. But could you tell us a bit about what has changed in practice since last year's discussion on integrating CCS and CDR into NDCs?
Yeah, sure. So I think the biggest shift in the discussion is we're not just simply asking whether these technologies appear in the NDCs. Our latest numbers are 60 plus, and we saw an increase from last year. One of the big stories for us actually was that India has included CCS in the NDC. So we're seeing a lot of interesting things happening there. But as I mentioned before, one thing that's coming out of Bonn is concerns on the usefulness of these NDCs for businesses and investors. So stakeholders are increasingly asking whether these NDCs are providing enough information on how countries intend to achieve their targets and which solutions they plan to prioritize. So there's also emerging discussions on NDC features and reporting formats, and it ultimately will determine how useful NDCs are as implementation tools rather than simply political commitments. So for carbon management, this matters because investors need more than net zero targets. They need clarity on sectors, infrastructure needs, policy frameworks, and implementation pathways. And even just in our analysis of carbon management in NDCs, we see a large variety of how it's mentioned. Sometimes it's just a sentence, sometimes it's linked to a specific national plan, and then it's more clear. So those kind of discussions are happening on the clarity of the NDCs and achieving the intention of the Paris Agreement, the objectives of that.
Thank you. We have a little over 10 minutes left in this webinar. I know we like to do this little 30-minute brief live from the ground webinar. But before I turn to audience questions, and there are a few already in the chat, I want to remind folks to submit their questions via the Q&A function. I'm going to ask you one last question from my list, which is, since CCS and CDR are now more visibly reflected in NDCs and global stock take outcomes, how quickly is that being applied to real-world scale-up?
So globally, I think it's worth mentioning there is this sort of backdrop of the kind of geopolitical situation in the world, and that really is reflected at Bonn. We have had a more, I would say, I've heard described subdued conference in terms of the number of delegates. And although there's a lot of activity, there is still sort of the backdrop of the geopolitical situation. So the implementation gap remains the dominant concern here. And the best illustration is the mitigation work program, which is really kind of the heart of the Paris Agreement, is that topic of mitigation of emissions. And negotiators here still haven't reached a text on some of the core issues. They're, discussing on two major questions at the moment: the future of the mitigation work program, which is likely to continue, and what signal this should send this year on industry, which is the current thematic focus. And the mitigation program itself is becoming a proxy for a much larger debate on implementation and the GST as well. So the linkage of the mitigation work program with the global stocktake has also been a topic. So some see it as a mechanism to help deliver GST outcomes, while others are more cautious about expanding its role. So the fact that the co-facilitators are still working on an informal paper rather than negotiating text just illustrates how much political work remains before COP31. And I think interesting for sorry, I know there's probably questions to get to.
No, go ahead, continue on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we had a few side events here that on carbon management, there was one that was, there were, and it really is mirroring the theme in Bonn, which is implementation. So the discussions were not about the legitimacy of carbon management or CDR. For example, it was more on MRV, accountability, Article 6, and how it all fits together. So the conversation around carbon management is maturing, but of course, deployment still depends on finance, infrastructure, and long-term policy certainty.
Okay, thank you. And our current carbon market structures actually fit for scaling engineered carbon removals. Is more required? And what are the discussions tied to this worth mentioning?
Okay, so we are moving in that direction. So with Article 6 on message that came clearly is the Article 6.2 ambition dialogue. So 6.2 is the bilateral aspect of Article 6, and many countries are still building basic infrastructure needed to participate effectively. So they're talking about registries, authorization systems, tracking arrangements, and they remain incomplete in many jurisdictions, and reporting obligations remain a challenge for countries with limited capacity. So parties are also debating how to finance the infrastructure needed for Article 6 implementation, and the discussions are highlighting an estimated funding gap of $8 to $9 million. So this becomes very significant, especially for engineered removals, because they have additional questions, and the architecture itself still needs still a significant amount of work to support removals at scale.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next audience question, which really kind of sums it all up. What are the main problems in deploying more CCS, and how is the UN helping?
So I will speak in the context of these negotiations. I think finance probably is the biggest political line in Bonn. One of the major debates is this climate finance work program, where parties are still divided on broader view of the climate finance architecture. And it's clear that public finance alone won't be sufficient. There's discussions on things like the Baku to Belém roadmap, which combines climate finance with international cooperation, private investment. But what's encouraging, I think, for carbon management is the linkage between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism. And that really kind of brings that technical support to bankable projects. So I think that those things are happening, but I would say finance, generally speaking, is really a sticking point, not just for CCS or CDR, but broadly across the implementation spectrum.
Right. And would you say have climate finance commitments meaningfully shifted to reflect carbon management technologies needs since the last roundtable?
So the way that these roundtables are designed is they're technology neutral. So there's no specific technologies that are mentioned at the moment. However, if you keep your eye on the Global Implementation Accelerator, there we are seeing party interventions on including carbon management CCS in that process. So, while CCS and CDR, it's not necessarily, especially with technologies, it's not specifically mentioned, but you will find some cases where there are kind of political signals that could include it. So Global Implementation Accelerator is one. We also have Global Stocktake, but all these things, as I mentioned, need to come together in a way that's coherent. So one of the things, for example, the mitigation work program, where a couple of years ago we had a day-long discussion on CCS in Bonn, actually, was how does that continue? So some parties don't want to link the two, GST and the mitigation work program. Well, as something it makes sense to have the two together, and obviously CCS is in the global stocktake, so it would be beneficial to have that continuation that can trickle down to the agenda items. So these kind of procedural things need to be sorted in order to just keep the wave of CCS flowing through the process.
I'm going to turn to another audience question. How do you think the dialogue at COP31 will be with regards to the CCS CDR now that the SBs are almost done?
So in the run-up to COP31, from now onwards? Okay. So we have London Climate Week. So we have a few kind of regional climate weeks that are sort of global milestones. We have London Climate Week, we have New York Climate Week, and we have different regional climate weeks that are coming up until COP31 in Antalya. So these will basically be sort of ways for countries and organizations to bring out key messages on different topics, including CCS and CDR. But really, when it comes to carbon management, I know explicitly included, we would have to just look out for the text that comes out of Bonn tomorrow, when it concludes, and whether carbon management is mentioned in things like the Global Implementation Accelerator, and then we can take that forward in COP and make sure it is part of the final decision. So the carrying forward when it comes to negotiating text will happen at COP31. In between is more kind of advocacy and awareness raising for carbon management. We ourselves, we do have a few events in New York and in London. So we'll definitely be we'll keep advocating for that.
Yeah, we'll see how those influence the dialogue at COP. Okay, one last question for you. 1 year on from the last discussions on NDCs, markets, and frameworks, what is the single biggest policy shift still needed to move CCS and CDR from planning to delivery?
So for this, I would maybe highlight that many of the negotiations this week are really discussions about kind of the architecture. So whether it's the future of the mitigation work program, preparations for GST2, the process itself, technology and finance linkages, parties are increasingly focused on how implementation is organized and delivered. And, in many ways, the next phase of climate diplomacy is not so much about creating new commitments, but building on, institutions that are capable of delivering the commitments that already exist. And I would say, there's, for example, there is this sort of trend where we're seeing, because of you can say stagnation happening in the negotiations, there are sort of the global climate action agenda that has emerged after Marrakesh, where it's more flexible, it's more fluid, it's voluntary, but there's still activity happening there. So there are that form as well that's becoming increasingly important. And another interesting development, and that's where things like the Carbon Management Challenge fall. So the Carbon Management Challenge hosts ministerials under the action agenda, and that's towards the gigaton goal, collectively managing and storing a gigaton of CO2 by 2030. But an interesting development in Bonn is also, the Netherlands-Colombia initiative, for example, is another example of things happening outside formal negotiations, and that's on the implementation of the transition away from fossil fuels. They got about 100 countries at Belém to sign up to this. It wasn't part of the decision, but it was something that countries voluntarily agreed to work on together. So those discussions are continuing now after the Santa Marta conference that happened. And this brings together governments and stakeholders to exchange experiences and identify pathways for delivery. But yeah, so for carbon management, I would say it's not just about recognition anymore. It really is about delivery and clear implementation signals. And for governments, investors, and businesses, it's just essentially the same sort of question: is once there's a target, what happens next? So
That was really good. Thank you, Nora. Is there anything else you'd like to mention from Bonn before we move? Maybe we can plug your briefing. We have, if people want to explore these topics further, download Nora's briefing, CCS and CDR, and the UNFCCC key policy entry points.
Yes, we have a brief on that. When you mentioned, we also have a couple of fact sheets. We have a fact sheet on defining carbon management, which my colleague Matt Antes led the writing for that one, which I kind of put a little bit in. And we also have a fact sheet on the policy entry points, and then we'll also have another sort of insight that will come out in maybe a week or a week and a half on the outcomes of that. So you can watch out for those.
That would be great. Yeah. So the Institute has several great resources that could provide some additional context on many of the issues discussed today. Well, thank you, Nora, for your time, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's webinar. like I said earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website. In the coming days, we put up a slide with a bit more info about reaching out to us, where you can find our publications, reaching out to us on social if you have any follow-up questions or are interested in membership. You can always get in touch with us at info@globalccsinstitute.com and stay connected with us on LinkedIn, where we regularly share updates and post, once we publish those insights and fact sheets that Nora mentioned. So thank you again for everyone's attendance and wishing you all a good day.